Well, good morning, friends. It's great to be with you. It's afternoon on the East Coast, but it's 9 o'clock in the morning here in San Diego, California. And we're very honored to have you joining us for the monthly webinar of Alliance for Hope International. As most of you know, we have a very special guest with us this month, Dr. Vincent Felitti, the co-author and co-investigator of the ACE study. And many of you are familiar with the ACE study, but we're looking forward to talking about it today and spending a little time on a new book that I wrote, really inspired by Dr. Felitti's work, called Cheering for the Children, that really focuses on working with children exposed to trauma and abuse. So we're very happy to have you with us. We are here in San Diego, as I mentioned. Natalia Aguirre, our National Director of Technical Assistance, is managing this webinar. Michael Burke, who's our Director of Community Engagement, is actually videotaping this webinar for future use for a variety of purposes, and you'll see on the screen the directions for this webinar. We have been recording all of our webinars, and they're available on our website at familyjusticecenter.com. This webinar as well will be also recorded. You'll see that we do not have live questioners on our webinars, but you do have the ability to click on questions if you're logged into the GoToWebinar meeting platform, and you can type in questions. Natalia will be monitoring those questions, and when Dr. Felitti and I finish our presentations, you will be able to have those questions answered at the end of the webinar. As I mentioned, my name is Casey Gwinn. I'm the president of Alliance for Hope International, and on behalf of Gail Strack, our CEO, and our entire team at Alliance for Hope, we're happy to have you with us today on this webinar. We always like to give a shout out to our small team. Gail calls it our small but mighty team that works with Alliance for Hope, and most of you are familiar with our work. We were formerly called the National Family Justice Center Alliance, and we've now changed our name. So Family Justice Center Alliance is now one of the programs that we run. We also run the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, Camp Hope America, and a variety of other programs as well. As we get started today, I do want to thank the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women for their support and sponsorship for this webinar, along with Blue Shield of California Foundation. We've been doing a lot of work with Blue Shield of California Foundation, and Marissa Torona and Peter Long and the whole team at Blue Shield. We're very honored to have them supporting our work in California in particular, where we've opened 17 family justice centers over the last 5 years. I also want to give a few shout outs to some upcoming events. We have a special advanced strangulation course sponsored by the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention coming up in San Diego. That will be available in August. That's a Justice Department sponsored event, so you do not have to pay for registration for that event, but it will be available to you. It's August 4 to 7 in San Diego, and registration has just now opened for that course, so we look forward to having you join us for that event. We're going to be talking a little bit more about it, but I do also want to just mention before I introduce Dr. Felitti my own journey in this. Some of you know that I have my own experiences with childhood trauma, much of which I did not talk about or deal with for many years, though I went through college and law school and became a prosecutor, and ultimately have worked for 30 years in the domestic violence movement across the United States and around the world. But as I began processing a lot of my own struggles with trauma from childhood, I did write a new book called Cheering for the Children. Dr. Felitti wrote the foreword for that book, and we'll be talking about that later. But that is available to you. Last night I had a very special time with some friends who are struggling with some profound issues with their 15-year-old son, and I had the opportunity to give them a copy of the book as they're dealing with a young man who's gone through a lot. We don't know what all it is, but he's very angry, and they're really struggling with how to deal with his behavior. And that whole reminder for me of not about his behavior. You got to get behind the behavior and talk about what's happened to him, and not what he's doing or what he's not doing or what he's doing wrong. We're going to touch a little bit on that today, but that's been my journey in this, is processing this, writing Cheering for the Children, and interviewing all 3 of my kids, my adult grown children, about how my trauma issues impacted them, even in our home growing up. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. It'll be available for download within about 48 hours. You can go to FamilyJusticeCenter.com, click on resources, and go to our online resource library. And you'll be able to listen to this webinar. You can put together a group of people and listen to it. Both the PowerPoint presentation that goes with it and the audio will be available to you at FamilyJusticeCenter.com once Natalia is able to download it. Well, it's my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Vincent Felitti to you. For 27 years, he was the head of the preventive medicine program at Kaiser Permanente. He is affiliated with the University of California. And some of you know we recently gave Dr. Felitti our Lifetime Achievement Award at Alliance for Hope International's 15th annual conference. And he provided a keynote address there. Without question, he is one of the leading doctors in the world on this issue of childhood trauma, coming out of his work many years ago in an obesity program in San Diego. And I believe that Dr. Felitti's work is going to change the way we do everything when it comes to working with adults and children exposed to trauma. Our biggest challenge now is simply educating professionals and the public about the ACE study, which is more than 10 years in the making now. And yet, when I go around the United States and ask large groups of people if they've ever heard of the ACE study, very few people raise their hands in audiences all over America. More so in the child welfare world, probably perhaps than any other. They raise their hands, but we have a lot of work to do. And in the Family Justice Center world, for those of you that work in domestic violence programs or family justice centers or community-based sexual assault programs, we believe this is crucial information. There's so much talk today about trauma-informed care. We can't do trauma-informed care if we don't know what the trauma is, and if we haven't let people tell their story to understand what the trauma is that they've experienced, both as children and as adults. But it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Felitti, turn it over to him as we dive into this presentation. And if you do have questions as we go, as I mentioned, you can type those in, and Natalia will be providing those to us. And Dr. Felitti and I will address those at the end of the presentation portion of the webinar. So Dr. Felitti, thanks for joining us today. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, Casey. Actually, in the very first slide that we have, you will see two photographs taken just a few blocks from here that depict what you have just been saying and essentially illustrate the core of the ACE study. If you were, there's a question implicit in these two photographs. If someone were to give you this newborn infant with its extraordinary potential and ask what you would have to do to develop that infant into the individual lying unconscious on the sidewalk, overlooked by this huge mural depicting how we innately are frightened of such things and tend not to see them, what would you have to do to develop that individual, that infant, into the individual lying unconscious? That really is a way of thinking about the ACE study. The ACE study is the largest study of its type carried out to determine the lifelong effects of 10 categories of remarkably common but unrecognized adverse life experiences in childhood, and how they play out roughly a half century later in the lives of 17,337 Kaiser Permanente members, clearly middle-class individuals with excellent health care, how they play out roughly a half century later. We got into this by accident, and you'll understand that in a moment, in our work in a major obesity program. And we discovered there that what we thought we were treating was not the real problem. It was the marker for the problem, the symptom. That's kind of a big idea. Obesity is not the problem, the symptom. Yes, absolutely. There's a good analogy to house fires here, that when you see a house burning down, what you see typically is the smoke billowing out. You've all heard smoke inhalation is dangerous and so forth. Just thank God that fire departments know that what they treat is not the smoke, lest they bring big fans to blow it away and make the house burn down faster, but the thing that's deep inside that you don't easily see, namely the fire. So the very essence of these basic causes was found to be unexpectedly high, overwhelmingly unrecognized, partly because they're so far back in time, and then they're further protected by shame and by secrecy and by social taboos against exploring certain realms of human experience. But their effect a half-century later is profoundly damaging and common. And indeed, the power of the effects is proportionately related, we found, to the number of different categories of adverse childhood experiences, which can range from 0 to 10 different categories. And they affect biomedical health, they affect mental illness, occupational performance, social malfunction, and premature death. We were very surprised to find that on average, a person who had experienced 6 or more of the categories, any 6 or more, because they're about co-equal in damage, had a life expectancy shortened by about 20 years. So let's look at some of the evidence for all of this. We could begin back in 1985 with this young woman who came into our obesity program. She was 28 years old, weighed 408 pounds, and asked us if we could help with her problem. Our first mistake was accepting her diagnosis of what the problem was, and so we naively said yes, and in 51 weeks took her from 408 to 132. Using the technique of supplemented absolute fasting, which is a quite extraordinary technique that allows one to take a person's weight down about 300 pounds a year. And we thought, well, my God, we've got this problem licked. You know, we really know what we're doing here. In rapid order, she taught us that we had no idea what we were doing, but merely were in possession of the powerful technology. She kept the weight off for several weeks, and then in one 3-week period regained 37 pounds, which I had not believed was physiologically possible. And I remember asking her, you know, what was going on. And she said, I think I'm sleep eating. What do you mean? Well, when I was a kid, I used to be a sleepwalker. I haven't done that for years, but I live alone, and when I go to bed at night, everything's clean and put away in the kitchen. And I wake up in the morning, boxes and cans are open, pots and dishes are dirty. Somebody's obviously cooking and eating there. I'm the only person there, and I'm putting on weight, but I have no recollection of any of this. But, you know, I guess that's what has to be happening. Okay, I've never heard of it before, but it has a certain force of logic. Why now? Why now? Why not, you know, last year? Why not 3 years from now? I don't know. She said, well, I understand. But what do you think? I don't know. I understand. But why do you think it's now? I don't know. You said that. And on the third pass, she stumbled and said, well, actually, there was this man at work. He was a much older man, you understand. And he was married, and he said to me, hey, Patty, you look pretty good. You lost all that weight. How about you and me making it every week? And that was the night the sleep eating began. And then I remember thinking, well, it's a pretty clumsy proposition. But I mean, this is 1986. You know, it is Southern California. It's kind of an extreme response. Why the extreme response? And pursuit of that led to a lengthy incest history with her grandfather from age 10 to about age 21. So weighing 408 pounds was a way of desexing herself, was a way of providing a big barrier, and ultimately losing that was very threatening. Anyway, she was quickly back over 400 pounds and disappeared for 12 years, but we'll come back to her later. She lowered our threshold for inquiry about childhood experiences, and pretty soon we were routinely inquiring about childhood sexual abuse. And I mean, I remember initially thinking, no, this can't be. You know, people would know if this were true, because it seemed every other person in the weight program I was asking was acknowledging such a history. You know, someone would have told me, wasn't that what medical school was for? 286 patients later, I presented our findings at a national obesity meeting in Atlanta, was attacked by the audience. Some guy gets up under the guise of asking a question and tells me that I really need to understand that these statements by patients are largely fabrications to provide a cover explanation for failed lives. And yeah, I was thinking, yeah, right. You know, people routinely claim incest histories for social aggrandizement. Anyway, there was a dinner for speakers that night, and seated next to me was someone from the CDC, and he said, look, you know, if what you're saying is true, it's got enormous importance to the country as well as the practice of medicine. But no one's going to believe your 286 cases. What we need is a large epidemiologically sound study with thousands of people in it, and from a general audience, not some strange group you put together in the weight program. Okay, well, back home in San Diego, I had an unusual department of preventive medicine, one division of which provided to 58,000 adults a year going through unusually comprehensive medical evaluation. How many do you think we ought to ask? We said, yeah, 26,000. That was about half a year's throughput for us. So my colleague, Dr. Robert Panda at CDC, spent the next 2 years reviewing the world's literature as to what was known about all of this, child abuse of various kinds and so on, long-term manifestations, figuring out how we're going to get the money and the workforce together to study all of this mountain of data. And we wrote the protocol that we submitted to the Institutional Review Board in 1994. And they turned it down, telling us, no, you can't use that questionnaire. That's going to be too damaging to patients. It'll cause people to decompensate. Maybe you can become suicidal and so forth. Well, we disagreed, thinking that, you know, asking people about their lives was not likely to do that. We battled that point for 9 months, though, and finally they agreed on condition one of us would carry a cell phone 24 hours a day for 3 years to take emergency calls from people we were going to make suicidal. Never got one call. Instead, I have a notebook of letters, largely elderly women, one of which memorably summarizes the rest. She wrote, "Thank you for asking. I feared I would die and no one would ever know what had happened." So the A study, the plan is, as we see here, the dark blue box in the middle means undergoing comprehensive medical evaluation in the department. The population average age was 57, almost exactly half men, half women, 80% white, including Hispanic, 10% black, 10% Asian, 74% had been to college. Everybody had high-end medical insurance. A clearly middle-class population. And so we studied this group of 17,500 people, matching current health status against 10 categories that I'll show you in a moment of adverse life experience during childhood and adolescence, infancy, childhood, and adolescence. And then we have been following them for the past 19 years, matching now what happened 50, 60, 70 years ago against current pharmacy costs, ER visits, doctor office visits, hospitalization, and death. So here are the categories that we studied on the next slide. 3 categories of abuse: heavy-duty emotional abuse. You are the stupidest kid I've ever seen. Or as a man told me recently, his father used to line the kids up and tell them, you kids ought to just be taken outside and shot. 11%. Major physical abuse, not spanking, I'm talking serious beating with fists, sticks, and other objects, 28%. Contact sexual abuse, oral, anal, or vaginal, not somebody flashing a kid. 28% of the women acknowledge this, 16% of the men, average 22% for the group. That was extraordinary. And they clearly basically you and me. 2 categories of neglect: major emotional neglect, major physical neglect. 5 of major household dysfunction, growing up in a home where one of the members of your household was an alcoholic or a drug user. Losing a biological parent before the age of 18. And that was interesting because we saw that if you're going to lose a parent, clearly the least damaging way was by death, unless that death were suicide. And the most damaging way was maternal abandonment. Mom split when we were 3 and we never saw her again. Most common is obviously divorce. An interesting and untouched subject in terms of childhood onset obesity, a very strong relationship that is totally untouched. Easier to blame McDonald's. Growing up in a home where someone was chronically depressed, mentally ill, suicidal, or in the state hospital, in a home where mother was treated violently, in a home where one of the household members was imprisoned during her childhood or adolescence. So this was really quite extraordinary to learn all of these things. And we were dealing with mountains of information, literally 400,000 pages of information between questionnaires and physical exam forms and lab slips. We needed some way of simplifying things, and we created a so-called ACE score. The number of categories, not events, but categories, was summed, and that could range from 0 to 10. And what you see is that 33% of this middle-class, middle-aged group claimed none of the 10, and obviously 67% claimed 1 to 10 categories. 11%, 1 out of 9 people, claimed 5 or more categories. So what that means is that every doctor in the country is seeing 2, maybe 3 ACE score 5 or higher patients every day. And the question is, how will they manifest? They will certainly not be recognized because we don't ask this information routinely. We saw that if any category was present, there was an 87% chance at least one other category was present. In other words, you don't grow up in a house where your brother's in prison or your mother's being beaten, but everything else is terrific. And we saw that women were 50% more likely than men to have a score of 5 or more. So let's look more into this. We'll go back to our original patient. You can't see the video clip here, but I'm meeting with her 12 years later. She is still safely over 400 pounds. She joins a group of patients that I put together who were in the 400 to 600 pound range. And the goal of that group was for them to help me understand what the engine was under eating yourself to death. So she comes in one day and says that her family has collected $20,000 for her to have bariatric surgery. And she has the surgery, and at a point where she has lost 94 pounds, which was not obvious to me. I mean, God, you lose 94 pounds and it's not obvious. Well, the volumetric reduction was not enough to be really clear. She became intractably suicidal at that point. 5 psychiatric hospitals in the ensuing year, 3 courses of electroshock to gain control of the situation. And about a year and a half after all of that, we're talking about why. And in this video clip, she expresses, my wall was crumbling. My wall was crumbling. The weight was coming off faster than I could handle it, etc., which was a terrifying thing. Well, by then, we had discovered that major weight loss is very often threatening to people, sexually threatening, physically threatening, threatening in other more subtle ways. So this was really a remarkable thing to see. In essence, she's talking about the unspoken benefits of weighing, being several hundred pounds overweight, and how losing those benefits was enormously threatening. Here's a man. This man is not obese, but he illustrates other problems. He's a very heavy smoker, a very heavy drinker, and a heavy user of the street drug crystal meth. And so he ordinarily is describing our 3 most common addictions, things that we describe as being dysfunctional behavior. But he speaks of them in terms of their functionality. He's a very bright man. I mean, in a very real way, this guy's an amateur psychopharmacologist. The backstory, which would ordinarily never be known unless one routinely sought this information from all people, the backstory is when he was 2, his parents divorced. He never saw his father again. When he was 5, his mother remarried. For whatever reason, his stepfather saw fit to beat him pretty much every day. He remembers one day when he's 8, he's walking to school, and the thought crosses his mind, nobody is ever going to be there for me in my life. When he's 21, he's imprisoned in Rhode Island for attempted murder. One day he comes home, finds his stepfather beating his mother, and with a heavy iron frying pan, he induces 5 long bone fractures in his father and 1 skull fracture, and is imprisoned for attempted murder because of this. Ultimately, he gets out, becomes a good citizen, works on major construction projects that keep him far from home, very responsibly sends his significant paychecks home to his 3rd wife, the nurse who believes in him. And he talks about how alcohol, crystal meth, and tobacco keep the door to the past closed. Very, very interesting. And what's really interesting is that what he is saying is pharmacologically sensible. Nicotine, for a long time now, has been known to have major psychoactive benefits. We're all focused on the long-term threats, which are major. But nicotine has potent anti-anxiety activity, antidepressant activity, appetite suppressant activity, and anger suppressant activity. And it manifests those 15 or 20 seconds after inhalation. The risks are very real. 15 or 20 years downstream, I think we all have some sense that if the screws are on tight enough, I need some help now. I'll worry about 20 years from now, next week, etc. So he was, again, one of our early teachers, that the things that we perceive as problems in public health are very often, for the individual involved, unconsciously attempted solutions to deal with things that the rest of us know nothing about. So here we're looking at smoking. I don't know what it's like where you all live, but in San Diego it's very difficult to comfortably smoke. You can't smoke on a public beach. You can't smoke in a public park. And in spite of the heavy public health pressure against smoking, there's been no significant decrease in smoking over the past decade or 12 years. And when we match being a current smoker in this notably hostile environment, you see that as the ACE score goes up, the likelihood of being a smoker goes up significantly. Oh, that doesn't, fit in with, well, recent people smoke as they pass a cigarette billboard on the way to school. This is very interesting. This so-called dose-response effect, the greater the number of categories of adverse childhood experience, the greater the likelihood of being a smoker as an adult. Next slide shows self-acknowledged alcoholism. The question we used was simple. Have you ever considered yourself to be an alcoholic? And here you see the same thing. As the ACE score goes up, distinct stepwise increase in the likelihood of being an adult alcoholic. Sit down, have a drink, relax. Well, some people need a lot of relaxing. Again, a functional behavior, which we dismiss as dysfunctional, has certainly got major long-term problems, no question about that. Here, we're looking at intravenous drug use. Now, this is interesting because this is really the major dose-response effect. I can't even fit ACE score 6 onto the slide because it is so wildly off the slide that it distorts everything else. At ACE score 6 or higher, the likelihood of being an IV drug user is 4,600% greater than the likelihood is at ACE score 0. And I remember the epidemiologist at CDC telling me, those were numbers the magnitude of which they saw once in a career. You think you read the latest cancer scare of the week in the newspaper, something increases prostate or breast cancer by 30%, and everyone goes nuts. Here we're talking 4,600%. Let me expand that point a little bit more because everyone knows about crystal meth, the evils of crystal meth, and it is a dangerous drug. But what nobody seems to remember is that the first successful prescription antidepressant introduced for sale in the United States in 1940 was methamphetamine. The very same chemical which in impure form and unknown dose is sold on the street as crystal meth. But isn't it dangerous? Well, no more so than, if you took 30 aspirin tablets instead of 2, no more so than if digitalis were sold on the street and used by people who had no concept of dose. So this is very interesting that these things, these street drugs that we think of only as dangerous, are actually have short-term benefit to the people using them. We only look at half the equation. Maybe that has something to do with why our results in treatment are so poor, because we're only dealing with half of the information present. So slowly we came to see that there was this public health paradox, that what are conventionally viewed as public health problems are often personal solutions to long-concealed adverse childhood experiences that we know nothing about. Let's go back to the original patient again, Patty, her sister. Her sister, in the video clip, is also over 400 pounds. It would be the easiest mistake to know. Obesity runs in the family, must be genetic. Well, the interesting thing is that speaking English ran in that family, and we don't jump to the conclusion that therefore speaking English must be genetic. She too was extensively molested as a child by her grandfather. She suffered from chronic depression as well as obesity, and as we looked into chronic depression, what we saw was that as the ACE score goes up, the likelihood of chronic depression goes up in the same dose-response manner, so that at ACE score 4 and higher, you're bumping a prevalence. of almost 60% in women in the red bar and 35% in men in the yellow bar. We looked at suicide attempts. This is really a powerful relationship. Again, we cannot fit A-score 6 or higher on the slide because it so distorts the rest of the information. At A-score 6 and higher, the increase in the likelihood of subsequently attempting suicide is between 3,100 and 5,000% greater than it is at A-score 0. And then, in the next slide, you see when we looked at who's taking prescription medication for depression roughly a half century after the fact, wow, I mean, you know, there must be something to this. No matter how we look at the problem, we're turning up the same thing. That there's a very, very distinct relationship to underlying A-score. So time doesn't heal, time conceals. We looked in different settings. We looked at how this plays out on the job. Well, that was interesting. You see in the left-hand information set that there's a clear relationship of underlying A-score to absenteeism. In the middle one, there's a clear relationship of underlying A-score to self-acknowledged serious financial problems. Oh, wow, that's interesting. That's verging on poverty as an outcome rather than as a basic cause. That's a very interesting idea to keep in mind. And in the third set, serious self-acknowledged problems performing one's own job properly. So this has major impact. Adverse childhood experiences have major impact decades later in the workplace. So we looked at the relationship to biomedical disease. This was interesting. Everybody knows since the Framingham study that there are certain underlying risk factors for heart disease, cigarette smoking, cholesterol, diabetes, hypertension, etc. Most people don't know that about 10 or 12% of people with heart disease don't have any of those recognized risk factors. But how do they get it? When we looked at them, we found that there was a very distinct relationship of heart disease when there were no conventional risk factors to underlying A-score. Well, how does that work? I mean, you know, it's easy to understand. Yeah, if you're a 2-pack-a-day smoker, feel better. Yeah, that's easy to understand. But when there are none of the conventional risk factors, how does that happen? Well, if we look at what's been learned in recent years, we found that it is recently recognized in the past decade or so that chronic major unrelieved stress releases certain pro-inflammatory chemicals in the body that cause inflammatory changes in the lining of blood vessels, causing them either to shut down completely or to act as magnets for cholesterol deposition, which partially blocks, sometimes completely blocks, those vessels. So this is a very, very interesting idea, an important one about the effects of major unrelieved stress on inflammatory changes in the body, causing blood vessels to shut down. Our first patient, Patty, died at age 42 of primary pulmonary fibrosis. Her lungs turned to scar tissue. It's recognized again in recent years that a significant piece of primary pulmonary fibrosis is due to chronic major unrelieved stress and the release of these pro-inflammatory chemicals causing the blood vessels, the very small blood vessels supplying lung tissue, to shut down and convert to scar tissue whatever piece of lung they had been supplying blood to. This is a very interesting woman, very nicely dressed, articulate, clear-spoken person, major job at a university. Exactly the kind of person that, well, there's no need to ask her any of these ugly questions. I mean, she's doing so well in her life. She must have had a wonderful life. Well, she talks about the terribly abusive childhood that she had, many categories: sexual abuse, beating, starving, recurrent humiliation, etc. She has had, as an adult, 3 different kinds of cancer, not relapses of the same cancer 3 times, 3 totally different cancers. It's pretty unusual. In her mind, there is no question that these are somehow related to what happened to her as a kid. Now, 25 years ago, I'd have dismissed that as just craziness. Again, in recent years, it's become obvious how that works. I had lunch a few weeks ago with a very interesting woman, a United States federal judge who had an extraordinarily abusive childhood. She had 4 different kinds of cancers, plus lupus, plus multiple sclerosis, all of which we found have relationships to adverse childhood experiences. Not the only thing underlying them, but very distinct relationships. So how does this work? Well, we all know that if you have an organ transplant, you need to be on lifetime immunosuppression so you don't reject the organ. Some of us will have heard that people on lifetime immunosuppression will have an increased risk of malignancy as a side effect. Oh, okay, so rather than dying of kidney failure next week, I'll take a risk that maybe in 10 or 15 years I might have some kind of cancer. The operating mechanism here is that we're all forming cancer cells every day at a very low level. Our immune systems destroy them in the background. We never know the difference. Getting cancer then means either that the rate of production is markedly increased, exceeds the ability of our immune systems to destroy those cells, smoking 3 packs a day will do that, or the ability of our immune system is markedly suppressed because of immunosuppression, so that it can't handle even the low level of normal production. So the latter is what's going on here. That chronic major unrelieved stress causes major immunosuppression, hence the mechanism. We looked at other outcomes, rape, which I once naively thought was fairly uncommon, distinctly related to what had happened earlier in life. We looked at the relationship to hallucinations, the making of madness. Now, to get this information, you have to ask everyone routinely, if you ever have visual hallucinations, acoustic hallucinations, etc. When you do, as we did with 17,500 middle-aged, middle-class people, you see that there is a very distinct relationship that at A-score 7 and higher, about 10% of people have hallucinations. Oh, I mean, the making of madness. And because we felt that some people would try to say, well, yeah, that's because at A-score 7, people are going to be used to alcohol or street drugs, and that's why they're hallucinating. And so we corrected for those in the light color bars, and you see that the relationship still maintains. So summarizing all of this, we saw that adverse childhood experiences of a very heavy-duty nature are remarkably common, overwhelmingly unrecognized. They have a major effect on adult health decades later, half century or more later, on adult disease burden and hence the medical care costs, on well-being, depression, and suicide rates, on alcoholism and drug use, on job performance, on disability, on social malfunction, and on subsequent generations. So, what do you do with this? Well, it was obvious to me that we needed to integrate this into medical practice, and so we took these trauma-oriented questions, so-called, and integrated them into the general medical questionnaire that was filled out at home, 10-page questionnaire, before people came in for comprehensive medical evaluation. That had a remarkable effect. When we looked, or when a mathematician in the data mining field looked into this in a 130,000 patient sample, 2.5 years throughput for our department, he found that the addition of these trauma-oriented questions resulted in a 35% reduction in doctor office visits in the next year, and an 11% reduction in emergency room visits compared to the year before. Now, the dollar value of that is in the multi-billion dollar realm. So the question is, how does this work? Now, for control group, when we were working in our usual manner, but without any of the trauma-oriented inquiry, we had an 11% reduction in doctor office visits in a subsequent year. So the routine addition of trauma-oriented inquiry into general medical evaluation, switching from a biomedical to what's called biopsychosocial evaluation, has enormous impact. And the question is, how does that work? You know, people have said to me, well, you know, how'd you do that? Just you send everyone to therapy, right? No, we didn't. Well, how'd you do that? And what we found was that by routine inquiry, initially by an inert mechanism, well-devised questionnaire, then following up on the exam room, they see on the questionnaire that, can you tell me how that's affected you later in your life? And listening and implicitly accepting was a very powerful form of doing that it seemed to have a major effect, producing shame and anguish in patients. And those forces are significant forces in determining how frequently people have outpatient visits. So the story here is that what happens in childhood plays out very powerfully in multiple ways: biomedical disease, emotional states, job performance, economic and educational outcomes, and so forth in adult life decades later. And that paying attention to this and routinely inquiring has been demonstrated in a 130,000 patient sample to have major measurable benefits. So imagine the possibilities for where you are. Maybe you're the next step in taking this into everyday use. If you want further information on any of this, here are some good sources for further information. Thanks for listening. I hope you can put this information to use in your work.
Well, Dr. Felitti, thank you for that brief presentation. You can find much more on Dr. Felitti's presentations by simply Googling it. And he's got a series of videos on YouTube that include the video clips that we're unable to play on the GoToWebinar platform. But we wanted to introduce the ACE study piece for many of you that have heard of it but are not terribly familiar with it. And for a few minutes, I want to take one approach on the practical application of this for our work at Alliance for Hope International in my own life personally. And then we'll take some questions. We do have some questions coming in, and we'll take those shortly. I learned of Dr. Felitti's work in the late 1990s as I had become the elected city attorney of San Diego, and Vincent and I had interacted a few times over those years with the San Diego Domestic Violence Council that he had participated in at times. I really didn't understand it very well, and I didn't take the time to understand it until I read a book called Ghost from the Nursery by Robin Carr Morse and Meredith Wiley that Dr. Felitti actually has been a part of and just wrote a new introduction for a new edition of that book. But in the late 90s, when that book came out, I was quite fascinated by it, and the work that Robin Carr Morse did in Ghost from the Nursery made it practical from a therapist standpoint, a child trauma therapist standpoint, of what this childhood trauma piece meant in the people that she was working with. And that was really my first exposure to Dr. Felitti's work. As the years have gone by, however, it's become more and more personal to me, and I just recently did publish Cheering for the Children, which is one of the first books that's ever been written targeted at the general public to try to first explain the ACE study and then put it in very practical, kind of positive, forward-thinking, strength-based kind of approaches to how to address this. Dr. Felitti's work is so unbelievably groundbreaking. The question now is, what do we do about it? How do we change the ending? We know that an ACE score of 6 is like a death sentence. It reduces life expectancy by 20 years, but what do we do about it? And there's so much great work going on all over the country. It's exciting to see what's happening in a host of systems. I talk about those quite a bit in Cheering for the Children, along with my own personal story. But I want to connect another piece, particularly for those of you that are police officers and prosecutors and victim witness advocates and parole officers and probation officers working in the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice systems of America in particular. One of the things that did come out early in the ACE study but has not been focused on a great deal is this whole issue of the relationship between ACE scores and criminality. And the more work that is being done on it, the stunning correlations that are being found. And I think it is the paramount issue of the next generation in dealing with the criminal justice system. This push to remove, quote, nonviolent offenders from prison in order to realign the system, and based on the realization that we can't keep locking everybody up to solve problems in America, is still missing the whole point of what's going on in the lives of those that we are locking up, and particularly what has gone on in the childhoods of those we are locking up. And we tend to want to reject that. We tend to want to say, if you're an adult and you commit adult crimes, you have to answer for them as an adult. There's certainly no dispute for me as a career prosecutor to that position. However, if you want to know why people are going off the top of the cliff, the best place to do that work is not at the bottom of the cliff. The best way to do that work is at the top of the cliff and figure out how to prevent them from going off the top of the cliff, which I believe is the calling of our generation as we go forward with the amazing work of Dr. Felitti. We know what trauma looks like when it plays out in an adult's life, but we don't see often the connection. This is Ronald Wayne Fry. Ronald Wayne Fry killed his landlord in a rent dispute in 1993. He was 31 years old. He was a gruesome murder of his landlord, and he was sentenced to death in North Carolina for the murder of his landlord. Nobody had any sympathy for him, and nobody cared particularly what had happened to him. That was the reality of it. He was executed by lethal injection in North Carolina on August 31st of 2001. The day that Ronald Wayne Fry was executed, however, the very day that he was executed, this is the picture that was in the North Carolina Peace Officer Standards and Training Manual. on how to detect child abuse in North Carolina. And the picture was of 9-year-old Ronald Wayne Fry, the day he was executed because he committed a violent murder with an adult, as an adult. This is the picture that was appearing in that post manual. This is when Ronald Wayne Fry needed us. This is when adverse childhood experiences needed to be addressed. Not when he was 31 and not when he was 41 at the time of his execution. Vince uses this quote regularly in his presentations by T.S. Eliot, "In my beginning is my end." And the ACE study has proven that that is true. However, the question becomes, how do we make that not true? How do we change the truth of T.S. Eliot's statement in our work? It's playing out every day. Those of you in the criminal justice system listening to this call all over America, in the juvenile justice system of America, you are dealing with childhood trauma kids. Dr. Bruce Perry says it this way: it's not the finger that pulls the trigger, it's the brain. It's not the penis that rapes, it's the brain. And the fascinating play out of the ACE study over the years is showing amazing findings around brain development and the adverse impacts on brain development of childhood trauma in ways that I never would have imagined as a prosecutor, nor did I particularly pay any attention to. The brains of childhood trauma victims, without intervention, without mitigation, without therapeutic support, the brains are totally different in a high ACE score child than they are in a child with a 0 ACE score. They are different. They can change, there's plasticity, they can adapt. We can make a difference, but that is the reality. I put a quote in Cheering for the Children from Mike Green, who used to be the district attorney in Monroe County, New York, when he wrote, "In all my years as a district attorney, I never prosecuted a capital murder case where the defendant did not have a serious history of child abuse." That's who we're locking up in America, not just for capital murder, but for the vast majority of all crimes. Children coming out of homes with high levels of childhood trauma. And the quote that I put in Cheering for the Children that grabbed me the most about this was this statement from the manager of 4 prisons in Imperial County and Riverside County when we were planning a family justice center recently in El Centro, California. And the initiation of this statement was me standing in front of the whole group in El Centro and saying, "I am convinced that the vast majority of all people we lock up in this country for all crimes have come out of homes with some mix of child abuse and domestic violence and/or drug and alcohol abuse." And this man came up to me at the end of that statement. He was beet red in the face, and he said, "You're wrong. You're just dead wrong about that statement you made." And I said, "Well, there's a lot of research to back me up based on my experience for the last 30 years as a prosecutor and as an attorney. I see this in the system. I work with a lot of trauma-exposed kids." He said, "No, you're just wrong." And I said, "Well, it's my opinion. I feel strongly about it." And he said, "No, you said vast majority." He said, "I walk the prison yard in 4 prisons I manage, and I've never met a prisoner that didn't have a history of child abuse and domestic violence and/or drug and alcohol abuse. I've never met such a prisoner in any prison I've ever managed. So when you said vast majority, you're dead wrong. It's 100%. And I told him he probably needed a vacation. But the point of it was not lost on me. That is who we are dealing with in the system. There's some interesting work, and Dr. Felitti has been connected to this by James Rivas and others in San Diego working with court-ordered offenders. These are child abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault offenders, where they started administering ACE. And I had the opportunity in writing Cheering for the Children to talk to James Rivas about his work in these court-ordered offender programs. And it may be difficult for you to see on the screen, but the finding is no great surprise. Incredibly high ACE scores represented in all child abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault court-ordered offenders. And when I talked to James Rivas, he said, "Don't forget, Casey, as well, even though their scores are incredibly high, many of them are pathological liars, and they're minimizing their trauma from childhood. They're not overrepresenting it, they're underrepresenting it." So he said, even though the scores are high in our research from ACE, they're actually way low to what I believe the reality is in what we're seeing in the people that we have coming to us from the criminal justice system. These are the people that we are dealing with in the system. I also put some very recent research in a longitudinal study out of Sam Houston University into Cheering for the Children. That is the latest research tracking longitudinally children witnessing domestic violence. And as Dr. Felitti mentioned, these are likely also children that have other trauma markers in their lives. There may be physical abuse, there may be sexual abuse, there may be neglect. There's a high likelihood that if they have a single marker such as witnessing domestic violence, they have other childhood trauma markers under ACE. But this is the stunning kind of finding after 20 years. Children from 75% of the families ended up becoming victims as adults, and children from 78.6% of the families ended up becoming perpetrators as adults. This is a learned behavior. It is an incredibly high percentage of victims and perpetrators of domestic violence that have been impacted by this in their childhood trauma experience, and that trauma experience repeats itself into the next generation. I have two slides that are basically summaries of how I see the ACE study. The first slide that's loading right now, the top half of that slide is really the findings from the ACE study. The bottom half of the slide is how the impacts of that trauma that children experience then plays out later in life, with the prevalence of criminal behavior, with the prevalence of a later potential sexual assault, depression, suicidality, as Dr. Felitti mentioned, bipolar disorder, diabetes, shortened lifespan. This is what we're dealing with. These are the clients in community-based programs across America. In many cases, not all, certainly there are victims that grow up in healthy, functional homes that as adults become victimized or as teenagers become victimized. But the reality is that much of it is generationally connected. So the real question in this journey is, what now? How do we take Dr. Felitti's amazing work, not only continue to benefit from his expertise and his guidance and his insight, but what do we do about it? One of the things I did in Cheering for the Children is I started looking at innovative programs across America, and we have many in school systems, in juvenile justice systems. One of the foundational elements is simply starting to measure trauma and starting to find those scores. And Vince, if you could just talk about that for a minute. One of the things I found was that of the 25 states that have administered ACE, including the District of Columbia, the stunning connection or consistency among the scores all over the United States. Can you just talk about that for a minute? I mean, those that are measuring it are finding very similar results.
Yes, I believe that's true. The CDC is now using the ACE study questionnaire to collect that standardized information, I believe, from 34 states in the United States every year. And the World Health Organization is using the same approach with, I think it's 16 European countries and 8 Asian countries, including China. So, I mean, there is worldwide interest in this, and repeatedly one sees essentially the same information coming out of these totally different social settings and countries.
Populations that are very different than middle class Kaiser Permanente patients.
Now, I mean, I think it's important to understand for people who use this kind of terminology, but wasn't that a biased sample at Kaiser? Absolutely. Doesn't bother us at all. If things are this bad in a predominantly white, clearly middle-class population, they surely don't get better. If you're part of an oppressed minority, if you're poor, if you're living on the street, if you're in prison, etc. Yeah, I mean, if things are this bad in a clearly middle-class population, then as you go down the scale, they don't get better.
For those of you that have had the chance to read Cheering for the Children, you know that I cite Judy Herman's work at Harvard Medical School in a book she wrote many years ago called Trauma and Recovery, about the historical work dating all the way back to Sigmund Freud's work in the late 1800s. And one of the things that captured me in that reading that I did and the writing that Judy Herman did was this notion of the talking cure and an amazing client of one of the colleagues of Dr. Freud named Anna O, who really believed that the talking cure was how she got better, being able to tell her story. So when Dr. Felitti started talking about the findings that simply asking them the questions reduced repeat doctor visits, that really rang a bell with me.
But not simply asking, but listening and implicitly accepting.
Mm.
And ultimately, I saw, interestingly, there was a strong analogy to confession in the Catholic Church. And I'm not saying that as a religious person, because I'm not. But confession has been in use for about 1,800 years, suggesting, maybe it meets some basic human need to have lasted that long. And the similarity of the process is someone is telling a person who's important to them, in one case a priest, another case a doctor, a nurse practitioner, something deeply shameful about themselves, typically telling for the first time, and coming out of that brief encounter realizing that I still seem to be accepted here. They still seem to think I'm an acceptable human being. This is a very, very important idea that a brief intervention, had a profoundly measurable effect in the multi-billion-dollar range. Now, is that all that one needs to do? No, but a simple intervention that we ordinarily avoid like the plague has a major measured benefit.
That's great. I do want to mention in this journey of what's going on around the country, Dr. Felitti put up a number of websites, including acesconnection.org, which is a blog site that connects this amazing community of ACES folks all over the United States that are working on this. I had the opportunity to interact with James Stevens, who manages that blog post, and a number of other websites, who's also writing a book on the ACE study that we're all very excited about seeing that come out soon. And as people are diving into this, they are figuring out how you take the lessons learned from ACE, how you apply them in trauma-informed care approaches and practices across the country in juvenile justice systems, school systems, and so many other places. I think we need to go deeply into ACE and domestic violence shelters and community-based programs and family justice centers. We need to ask. We need to listen. We need to stop condemning. We need to focus on what's the underlying cause, the fire, not the smoke, as Dr. Felitti said. We also need to do some other things, I think. One of the things that I found in Cheering for the Children, in writing Cheering for the Children, was I couldn't find a mentoring program in America that was totally targeted on high ACE score kids. There are mentoring programs. There's some great models that I write about in Cheering for the Children, but nobody is intentionally testing, surveying ACE scores among children, and then connecting them with a mentor. Because one of the things that struck me in Cheering for the Children was when I talked to people with very high ACE scores and interviewed them, if they got out, if they found their way to functional, healthy adulthood, they always said, I had a teacher, I had a youth minister, I had a coach. They always pointed to a cheerleader in their life, somebody that listened to their story, loved them no matter what, encouraged them, supported them, didn't condemn them in that journey. They always had somebody in that category. And I do believe that's a huge piece. The other thing that we've begun to see at Alliance for Hope International in our camping program and in a variety of other work we do with children is that children finding children that have gone through similar experiences and finding support together from each other is unbelievably powerful. And there's great research I cite in Cheering for the Children about the power of peer support. Not just we know it's true among adults, but among teenagers. And we see it consistently, and the research is beginning to show it. And I do believe, as you listen to this webinar and reflect on it, the question that we have at Alliance for Hope is, how are you creating pathways to hope for every adult and every child, and how are you measuring your impact from it? We've made a decision at Alliance for Hope to use hope theory. We work with the University of Oklahoma and one of the leading hope theorists in America, whose name is Dr. Chan Hellman. And we're now measuring ACEs and we're measuring hope, because you can actually measure hope in the lives of trauma-exposed children and adults. And as we're beginning to measure it, we are starting to talk about the kinds of things that we see impacting positively HOPE scores and mitigating ACE scores with activities, behaviors, programs that many call trauma-informed, which I don't mind that term, but that's not the end of the story. There's got to be substance to that trauma-informed work that connects to advocacy and strength-based approaches that build people up and give them tools to begin to address the challenges that they're facing. Because just talking about it does not solve all the problems, and choices continue to get to be made, as Dr. Felitti said, because their choices are a solution to the problem. It may be an unhealthy solution and it may have profound consequences to them, but those choices and the way they mitigate that trauma are actually part of their solution to addressing trauma, and we have to give them other choices and other mechanisms and other approaches. I did want to give a shout out to our Camp Hope program before we wrap this up. There's lots of people doing great work around the country working with trauma and kids in all kinds of programs across America. We've chosen camping and mentoring as one of our primary focus areas. We went statewide in California in 2013. In 2014, we added more community-based sexual assault and domestic violence organizations to the mix of kids coming to camp in an evidence-based camping program called Challenge by Choice, where we focus on a strength-based approach to building kids up and letting them find each other and the journey that they've been through. I'm particularly impacted by it because I just finished the third week of our Camp Hope program this summer in California. We just had 33 amazing children come to Camp Hope at Lopez Lake in Central California. And I spent a week with these kids who have unbelievable challenges in their lives, and they are going to be your kids in the juvenile justice system. These are the young kids here, 7 to 11. They're going to be your kids in the juvenile justice system in a few years, and this is when we need to save them. By the way, we administered ACE last week. I was just telling Dr. Felitti this to kids from Redding, California. Michael Burke started Camp Hope in Redding, California at One Safe Place, Shasta, a couple of years ago. And Michael just administered the ACE questionnaire to the teenagers last week at Camp Hope, and the average ACE score was 7. 7. This is the high-end, high-risk population that Dr. Felitti just presented on, and they're 11 and 12 and 13. Those are the kids we need to be focused on, and that's the age group that we need to focus on. We've published 2 preliminary reports about our impact using ACE and HOPE with the University of Oklahoma. Those are available on our website. We can prove now that our program is evidence-based, and I think anybody doing mentoring with kids, anybody doing interventions with kids should be measuring their success. Just because you're doing work with kids doesn't mean it's good work, and it doesn't mean it's changing the endings. It doesn't mean it's changing the way children view themselves and their futures. We need to be able to prove it, and we need to be able to document it. This is one example of the administration of the validated Children's Hope Scale that we administered, and we can actually now prove a statistical change in the way children view themselves and their futures by investing a mentor in their lives and taking them to at least an annual camping experience that gets them away from the situation that they're in and gives them the opportunity to be able to look toward the future. And that's the thing that grabbed me most in writing Cheering for the Children was children with hope have far better outcomes. And if we don't give them hope in the process of addressing their adverse childhood experiences, we're not producing anything. If we just tell them, you know what, you're screwed. What's happened to you is bad and the outcomes are ugly and you're going to die young and you're going to have lots of health issues, that's not hope and that's not a pathway. And we need to figure out how to give them the pathway. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. We have about 15 minutes left, and Dr. Felitti, we have a whole variety of questions that have come in, and we're going to spend a little time on them. I'll just jump into these, shall we?
Sure.
If you can, the first question kind of asked you to talk a little bit about this whole issue of psychotropic medications and the impact of medications versus the underlying, dealing with the trauma, and kind of your view on, and we see this a lot, by the way, in Camp Hope. They're medicating children right and left that have profound childhood trauma issues. And instead of perhaps dealing with the underlying issues, how do we deal with the underlying trauma issues? So there's about 4 or 5 questions actually that raise that specter of medication versus trauma interventions.
I think the issue there is that as long as we don't have a routine mechanism for reliably obtaining trauma-oriented information from patients in medical or related settings, then the only tool available will be medication. And that falls far short of what we now know is possible. So the real question is not one of whether medications are good or bad, but the real question is whether we obtain information on underlying causality. And what we have found, importantly, is that simply obtaining that information, if one does it reasonably adeptly, simply obtaining that information is itself beneficial if there is implicit acceptance of the individual as a acceptable human being in that process. Now, other forms of treatment that we have found useful: autobiographical writing, very helpful. A psychologist named James Pennebaker, Pennebaker, at the University of Texas, has studied this, written extensively about it. Look his name up on Amazon and see what he has done. The technique EMDR, very useful, particularly because a lot can be accomplished in a very small number of sessions, hence making this form of treatment economically available to large numbers of people. The same thing with medical hypnosis, Ericksonian hypnotherapy. The American Society of Clinical Hypnosis website can be referenced. A great deal can be accomplished in a very short period of time if you can find an experienced medical hypnotherapist. So those are worth keeping in mind.
Now, I do want to emphasize one of the things I found in writing for Cheering for the Children. It matters how qualified the therapist is in doing any of these techniques. I've documented a number of very unpleasant and unhealthy experiences with a number of these techniques where therapists, I don't think, were properly trained and were not doing good work. So I agree that those interventions are very helpful with many. But it's not all good news if the therapist doesn't know what they're doing or does not properly apply the techniques. Dr. Felitti, there's a number of questions here kind of really questioning, your statement that these categories are equal. So they're, how can it be that one person asked, how can it be that, divorce is the same as child sexual molestation and its traumatic impact? Or I think you could probably apply those to any of the factors. Can you talk a little bit about what you found in the study and views on that?
Ultimately, I don't have an answer to that. I can simply tell you what we found in the 17,500 person sample. I mean, we were surprised, but on the other hand, at every turn we were running into something unexpected and surprising. So roughly speaking, the 10 categories were co-equal. In other words, if you looked at the outcomes of A-score 4 or A-score 6 or A-score 7 or what have you, it didn't matter which category made up that A-score. You ended up with essentially the same amount of damage. So the categories, to our surprise, were indeed approximately co-equal.
The other thing that a number of people asked about was this notion about cumulative trauma and chronic stress and the impact of being sexually molested once versus being sexually molested 50 times.
Yes, that's easy. We realized, or particularly my partner, Dr. Anda, at the CDC, realized that we were going into realms that people would try to deny or destroy, and that one of the ways of doing that would be, well, I mean, 50 years later, you think somebody reliably remembers whether they were molested 9 times or 12 times? Come on, this data is not worth looking at. It's not reliable. Forget it. So he quite wisely foresaw that happening. That what we were learning was very threatening to people, and so we decided that we were not going to try to count the number of the number of events or incidents, but rather the number of categories of events. So if you grew up with an alcoholic and a drug user in the house, that was simply 1 point of category. So it didn't matter whether you were molested twice or 32 times. It was simply 1 point to the category, and it worked.
There's an interesting question here talking about, we talk a lot in domestic violence work, and we have over the years talked about, the learned behavior nature of growing up in a home where you believe violence is normative, watching it, and then ultimately repeating it in some form. This question writer says, I believe it's important not to look at this as learned behavior, but rather as the expression of a mind that is organized by a survival brain driven by the limbic system and the lower brain stem and vagal nerve. It's not learned behavior, it's how the mind organizes behavior when it is directed by the limbic system and lower brain centers. Behavior can be better understood as top-down and therefore suggests that teaching and reteaching can create needed change. Trauma-based behavior has more of a bottom-up influence. Can Dr. Felitti speak to my statement here?
Basically, no. You're verging towards the issue of epigenetic effects. We did not study epigenetic effects. They are real. I mean, when we formulated the A-study protocol, 25 years ago, the word epigenetics was barely ever heard. The field has bloomed rapidly. Epigenetic effects would be certainly a part of all of the mechanisms involved. We did not study them. I cannot go further in terms of responding to the question.
I do think it's a good point, though, and I do think that Dr. Bruce Perry's work and Becky Campbell's work at Michigan State and many others, Linda Chamberlain in Alaska, have begun to look at this whole issue of, when someone is in a state of hypervigilance, when someone is in a state where they're constantly scared, where they've got hormones flushing in their brain, it does have impacts, and they do tend to react very differently in high-stress situations. We certainly have seen that. I talk a lot about that at Cheering for the Children and cite quite a bit of the recent research that it really does impact how the brain operates. And so there is a lot there that does have to do with trying to mitigate those impacts. And for children to learn to self-regulate and self-regulating behaviors that cause them to be able to step back from that state of arousal and hypervigilance when they trigger, we see that a lot in the Camp Hope world. There's a number of things folks asked you that I think you've addressed, but a number of people did question this notion of how could it be that simply doctor visits went down because you were asking questions. Couldn't it be because they were afraid of going back to the doctor, or they were intimidated by the medical system, or let's touch on that?
Absolutely. Very, very good point. We had inadvertently answered that several years earlier. A friend of mine who was chief of psychiatry at the time wanted to bring a young psychiatrist into the medical group. He was an interesting fellow. He was also a fully trained psychoanalyst, but he didn't have the budget to bring him in his department, and asked me if I could carry him on my budget for 6 months, and then he'd pick him up. Okay, I don't know what we'll do with this guy, but we'll give him an office, and maybe something useful will come out of it. Well, the examiners in the department were very pleased to have him present, because instead of having to say to patients, well, look, I'd like to refer you to psychiatry, and occasionally getting a response, God damn it, I'm not crazy, I ain't going there, etc. Now they could say, well, look, Dr. Shannon down the hall has had a lot of experience with this, so when we're through, I'll bring you down there and introduce you to him. And so Dr. Shannon would see these patients immediately. 1 hour psychiatric interview, dictated note, and our impression was this would be helpful to people downstream to know how to deal with this patient. He leaves in 6 months to go to psychiatry. I write a hand-signed letter to every single patient he saw, inquiring whether it was helpful, explaining this was an experiment on our part, etc. I was deluged with responses. I mean, I couldn't believe the response rate. Everyone except one wrote back how they liked it. And I thought, damn, I didn't ask if you liked it. I asked if it was helpful. So I was berating myself for having lost the opportunity. A friend of mine suggested, well, why don't you wait a year and count doctor office visits? Oh, okay, yeah, so we did that. The patients that Shannon saw for this one-time interview had a 49% reduction in doctor office visits in the year subsequent to that. Moreover, when we looked at their medical records, there's his note, my dictated note. No one went near that information in terms of using it. So clearly, whatever happened had to have occurred in the context of that 1 hour interview, and everyone except one person, in other words, 99+% had indicated how they really liked it. So I think that's a clear answer to the question that you're raising.
There's a number of questions here about what do you believe is the earliest stage that a child could take the ACE questionnaire. Do you think that there's an age limit or an age cutoff, or at some point where maybe children are too young to be getting asked those questions?
I simply don't know. It's a very good question. I see adults only. Maybe you're the one who could answer that question for the rest of us.
Mm-hmm. I will say that working with Dr. Felitti, we have begun using the questionnaire. We can make it optional when we talk to kids to let them take the questionnaire or not. We tell them what it's about, and they're free to take it or not take it. Some kids do trigger when they take it. We basically started with 12-year-olds and up. We don't give it to children younger than 12. We have found some emotional reaction from children while taking it, particularly children who have been sexually molested. However, I will say that the kids, overall, the kids are not negatively impacted by taking it. It seems to be somewhat of a cathartic experience. You talked about it. It seems to be somewhat of an acknowledgement that this is real, and this is why they're all here together, and this happened, and there's no shame in that, and there's no reason that they should feel terrible about themselves, that we're there to help them and to support them.
Yeah, I agree. I suspect that there would be little risk if this was done reasonably skillfully. You know, and again, I will use confession in the Catholic Church as an analogy. One does not hear of people going to confession and committing suicide on the way home as a result of that.
There are a number of questions, and we're going to run out of time here shortly, but there's a number of questions about kind of this whole issue of historic oppression, structural oppression, and the use of the criminal justice system in America to attempt to address social problems and public health issues such as what we have discussed here. One writer says, I accept the premises of the ACE study and the need for trauma-informed care for prevention and treatment and less incarceration, but how does this research take into consideration that prisoners are also there for structural rather than internal reasons? Michelle Alexander has informed us that from 1960 to 2000, there was a 600% increase in incarceration rates in the United States that did not reflect a change in the commission of crimes. To some extent, it reflected a change in the definition of criminality. How do we merge an understanding of structural oppression into our understanding of trauma? And I will just touch on that briefly. I think that Eric Holder's work in the Defending Childhood Initiative and the Attorney General's kind of really interesting work connected to defending childhood has touched on quite a bit of this. And without question, poverty does play a role in that, and historic oppression does play a role, and communities of color are heavily overrepresented in the criminal justice system because of structural oppression issues. There's no doubt about it. I don't think anybody should be able to deny it with a straight face. And the reality is, I think from my perspective, we need to be focusing on dealing with the trauma. And I don't think there's a trauma-informed prison system in America. And I don't think anybody goes to prison and comes out having mitigated their trauma impacts by being in an incarcerated setting. So I don't know if you want to touch on that, but I think all of that is true, and I think it needs a lot more discussion on how we revamp not just the criminal justice system, but the juvenile justice system, which is a system that is woefully failing teenagers who end up in the delinquency system because of choices they're making, because of childhood trauma stuff that's happened to them.
I cannot add significantly to what you have just said, Casey. I think you have touched on important points there, and correctly so. The ACE study points out how what goes on at home, and which is protected by shame, by secrecy. You don't put your dirty laundry out on the line for people to see, etc. Is a profound force that is overwhelmingly unrecognized.
There's a couple other pieces talking about psychodynamics, and I'll touch on one of these. A number of people have asked about it. This one writer says, in psychodynamics, one of the three main types of interpretation is called genetic interpretation. It's exactly that, connecting past to present with the hope of decoupling the two. What do you think of psychoanalytic development theory, which also observes correlation between things like obesity and early deprivation? It seems like that would be a highly specific framework for the points at which one would have to intervene in the children's lives in order to produce the change that you're talking about.
Well, I guess my question would be deprivation of what? Deprivation of food or emotional deprivation? I mean, what we have seen in the population that we studied was the high correlation of obesity with emotional deprivation.
We're going to wrap up here shortly. I do just want to, there are a number of other comments about supporting mentorship programs, but the realization that a whole host of systems that have been put in place can also fail children, whether it's the foster care system, whether it's a mentorship program or youth intervention programs. And I totally agree with that. I don't think you can slap a label on it and say we can solve all this with mentors, or we can solve all this with one thing or another thing. I said in Cheering for the Children that one of the phrases that annoys me the most is it takes a village to raise a child. I find that unbelievably annoying because it matters who's in the village, and it matters what they're doing to the children in the village and how they're treating the children, and the value of the children and the values of the village matter. And so yes, I get that. I get the importance of what's going on with the children that we're trying to help and who's doing it. And sadly, a lot of children do end up in a situation where an adult outside the family has influence that is negative. I remember growing up as a child, and I had a Little League coach that just screamed at the kids. That was his approach to motivate us. He was an abusive human being. And just the fact that I was playing Little League did not create mitigation in my life for the trauma I was experiencing at home. In fact, I was almost as scared of my Little League coach as I was of my dad, even though the Little League coach actually never hit me during that process. So that piece, I think, is certainly well worth mentioning, but I don't think it detracts from the need for it. And there's another couple of questions, Dr. Felitti, that came up, and they were asking about, a number of people asked about resiliency studies and resiliency formats and surveys, and why I didn't talk more about resiliency and Cheering for the Children. And I guess my answer is I believe that hope is more powerful, and hope does produce resiliency. And I didn't find those surveys on resilience to be particularly helpful in the direct work with children. I can measure hope in kids, but it's tougher for me to use those resiliency surveys. So in answer to those of you that have read Cheering for the Children, I really felt that focusing on how to build hope does build resiliency and competency, and those things that create protective factors in children's lives. So Dr. Felitti, I know we're out of time. I need to wrap this up. But closing comments, observation before we wrap up.
We should say something about primary prevention. We have been talking largely what one does after the fact, which is enormously important. It's enormously kind. One learns a great deal from doing it, etc. But in fact, it is nibbling at the edges of the problem. One can turn oneself into the next Mother Teresa or Albert Schweitzer and be so busy kindly helping people that one doesn't realize that the bulk of the problem is untouched. So primary prevention. My partner, Dr. Anda, and I both feel that primary prevention is the key thing. Now, no one knows how to do that right, but it's the right problem to focus on. My belief is that primary prevention would involve trying to improve parenting skills across the nation. The low-hanging fruit there is that huge portion of the population that has had no experience with supportive parenting themselves, hence is unlikely to replicate it with their own children. So how could one help tens of millions of people understand what supportive parenting looks like so that some of them might well pick up and do that? I believe television would be the main vehicle, storytelling on television. What if one were to develop a serial program, a soap opera, if you will, that had woven into the storyline illustrations of what supportive parenting looks like and how it plays out decades later, contrasting that with illustrations of destructive parenting and how it plays out decades later? I believe that would attract a great deal of interest and attention, and hence advertising support. Some of the listeners may have interest in theater, in broadcasting, and so forth, and be able to develop that idea to pursue it. That developing a pilot program for such a series would be a very interesting and important idea in terms of primary prevention.
Well, Dr. Felitti, thank you so much. We've gone over our time, but it's just a very special experience to have you with us on this broadcast. And for those that have been listening, sorry that we've gone slightly over. There's just so much we could have talked about in a very short period of time. This webinar has been recorded, and Natalia will be downloading it to FamilyJusticeCenter.com, and it will be available to you in about 48 hours. We appreciate you joining us today. I do appreciate you letting me talk a little bit about cheering for the children, and it was a very personal journey for me to go through some of my own issues. My father passed away in 2009. My story was particularly complicated for me to journey through with counseling and addressing it because my abuser was also my cheerleader, and my abuser was also my mentor. And so it had a lot of complex twists to it in my journey. And no family is all good or all bad. There were a lot of good things in my family, too, that created resiliency and competency in my life, even in the midst of trauma impacts. So if you have an interest, I'd encourage you to go to FamilyJusticeCenter.com, get a copy of Cheering for the Children. As I mentioned earlier, we have an upcoming advanced strangulation prevention course, August 4 to 7 in San Diego. If you're interested in our work in the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, we'd love you to join us. Go to strangulationtraininginstitute.com to get more information about that. Our institute is the most comprehensive institute in the country on this topic, and the most dangerous men in the world strangle women. And we now believe that they're also the cop killers, and they're more likely to be killers of children and others. Men who strangle women are the men we need to focus on. And we failed in dealing with this as well. So I'd really like you to focus on that. Bring a team to San Diego in August if you're interested in being with us. I want to thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned, my name is Casey Gwinn. I'm the president of Alliance for Hope International. On behalf of our CEO, Gail Strack, and our entire team, we want to thank Dr. Felitti for joining us. Vince, thank you. Thank you for your life-changing, world-changing work. And we look forward to being able to take that work forward in the years to come and figure out how we change the endings for children exposed to trauma and abuse, and how we change the endings for adults exposed to trauma and abuse. So blessings on all of you in your work. Thank you for being with us today, and we'll look forward to having you join us again for a webinar in the future. Bye-bye.